Welcome to We Mean Business. I'm Steve Dorfman. The question we're asking today is, why do people do stupid things in the workplace? We've brought in the expert. We're here with Dr. Thomas Hoffman. Thomas is a former NIH and FDA research scientist with over 100 biomedical and clinical research articles published. Thomas, welcome to the show.
Pleasure to be here.
When we talk about stupid things in the workplace, can you give us some examples of what we might be talking about, looking at?
Well, we could probably take up the entire half hour just with the examples. As we know that stupidity is pervasive and it leads to all sorts of unanticipated problems. The one that comes to mind is a CEO of a very successful startup. The company was doing fairly well, but had the usual financial hiccups. They instituted a freeze on bonuses and salary. One of his key employees, a man a bit older than he and probably had more experience than he, said that this was not consistent with his view and asked for a bonus. He denied it. The employee was consistent and threatened to leave. And the CEO was concerned that if the person left, things would be even more problematic. He gave him the bonus under the table, off the books, and actually paid for part of the bonus with his own money.
Oh my gosh. Okay. So, how what is the thinking? How does somebody get motivated to do something that to the rest of us seems just so irresponsible and, quote, stupid?
Well, there are a lot of reasons, and each case is individual. And rather than talk about what motivated, if that's the right word for this individual, we can find some principles today that underlie stupid behaviors, and that's what I'd like to share with you. Scientists, psychologists, neuroscientists, also, economists these days have studied what motivates us or determines or leads us to do stupid things. And without giving the whole message right away, it's because we're not thinking or we're not thinking with our entire brain. We're thinking with parts of our brain, and the connections that really are necessary to make good decisions for a variety of reasons aren't there.
Well, maybe we'll get a chance at some point today to talk about how we can work on that part of our brain.
Absolutely.
You say that when it comes to neuroscience and psychology, that we actually know very little about what causes these stupid behaviors.
Well, little is relative. I'm fond of saying, I think you've heard this quote from me, that my neuroscientist colleagues say, we know about neuroscience today what Galileo knew about physics. That doesn't mean we don't know. We're starting to learn a couple of key findings. They come from the advent of neuroimaging studies, where we can actually look at what parts of the brain light up. But we also derive knowledge in this area from experimental psychology, and most interestingly, in recent years, from economics. So the confluence of psychology, economics, neuroscience, and a little bit of old-time psychology, old-time psychoanalysis and psychotherapy helps us understand at least the principles much better. And I'm happy to share some of those with you.
Well, I'm sure business owners would love to know, are there some simple steps that we can all take? Maybe it starts with the hiring process. Are there some steps that we can take to have our employees and even our coworkers act more intelligently and try to avoid these stupid behaviors?
Right. I can certainly give you the bottom line now, but I think it's also helpful to understand the underlying bases for this in order to inform what steps we take to guard against or find antidotes to stupidity. But in 25 words or less, it boils down to knowing yourself, knowing your limitations, knowing what's going on, and paying attention to your emotional state. If anything, that would be the key message that I would leave you and your viewers with. Many people say just do it, and that's okay. My view is reflect on it, then do it. And by reflecting on it, not just cognitively, but emotionally, finding where you are when you're making these choices, and that'll help quite a lot to help make these choices better.
As a customer service trainer, I see stupid things happen all the time. As a customer, a guest of a restaurant, there's this one thing that I see happen at a particular restaurant with a particular server on a regular basis, and that is I'll ask for coffee, and he'll go and put on a fresh pot, and of course that takes, let's say, 5 minutes before the coffee's ready. And he'll come and put the hot cup of coffee down in front of me, and I'll have to remind him that I now need a spoon, cream, and sugar. And of course, he had 5 minutes while the pot was brewing to be proactive and anticipate my needs. But this happens every time. So, that's just one example of the things that I see. I'm sure a lot of people see in the workplace. So, what would cause that? And how, what can we do to change that pattern? Is it a pattern?
Yes, it is a pattern. And the pattern basically comes to, if people are in an altered self state, sometimes a bad mood, or a mood where they're not focused, or that doesn't allow them to focus on what they're doing, they're going to make decisions, do things willy-nilly, if you will. And it really starts with the emotional state. Now, again, I don't know the details of your case, but I'm guessing your waiter is pretty harried most of the time. I'm guessing that he certainly doesn't want to give you the wrong product. He certainly doesn't want to make you wait.
He's a good guy.
But he's thinking about other things. And when I say thinking, not necessarily with his cortex, thinking with the lower parts of his brain. And that can somehow interfere. So whether it's a coffee cup in a restaurant or making a highly important strategic decision in the boardroom, there's a balance between the emotional parts of our brain and the rational or executive parts of our brain that are almost like a teeter-totter. They have to be in balance. And if one part or the other is out of balance, that's when we do stupid things.
So if I was his manager, what would I do to address this?
Well, the first thing that I would do is look at his work environment. Is he having too many tables? Is he too stressed in his job? Does he have ways in his job to relieve stress? But also, I think the most important thing is just call the situation to his attention. If you have a customer who wants a cup of coffee and doesn't have a spoon, how do you think that customer feels about you and about our product and about our restaurant after he's been treated that way? I think one thing to avoid would be to ream the guy out, which is a frequent response when people do stupid things or things that are not productive. And that might be necessary in certain cases if someone is really incapable of doing the job. But I think it's really much more important to work on the self state, as we call it, the mood in the restaurant, what's going on underneath the surface, both individually and as an organization. And that's actually a big part of my work.
Say more about that, the mood of the situation of the restaurant.
So there are a lot of studies that show how important mood is in making a decision.
And we're not talking about the mood of an individual necessarily.
It can be the mood of the individual for individual choices and the mood of the organization. And you may think of an organization as a kind of individual if that's
Okay.
not too crazy, that has a certain mood and that has a certain
Are we talking
mindset.
about culture here?
That would be culture, and I have more to say about that later.
Okay.
But the mood of an individual and the mood of an organization have some things in common. So people who study this, and these are the experimental psychologists, give people a task, and they measure the performance on the task. Then they alter the situation. They might ask the subject, similar to your coffee situation, to wait a long time before the test gets going, or even treat them rudely during the time leading up to the task. Or they might show them a disturbing video before the task. Any of these mood disturbances invariably result in poor performance. So how the people feel makes a difference in how they perform. And conversely, interestingly enough, if you give the same people a so-called mood freezing pill, which is really a placebo, their mood stays the same, even in the face of disturbances, and they perform better.
Wow.
And it's
Interesting.
very prominent.
Yeah.
Very prominent.
Wow. There's something else that I tend to see a lot, and I know I'm not alone. We see this all the time. You're the passenger in somebody's car, so you're not the driver. But you notice the driver does something, quote, stupid. And it's never their fault. It's always the other driver. I'm sure that I've been guilty of this, but it's just funny to watch as the passenger in a car, the driver never taking responsibility for the, quote, stupid behavior, always blaming it on the other driver. Maybe even honking their horn aggressively to, you know, as a way of blaming the other person.
You drive with my mother-in-law.
I mean, this is...
She's a great driver.
It seems... It seems like this is the majority of people on the road. So help us understand this.
Okay, so people in general are in an altered state frequently when they drive a car, for whatever reason. Even if they've had a bad day at work, they've had a fight with their wife, or their kids are acting up. That's not to say that they don't have to be accountable, but just simply pointing out the error doesn't really help. What really helps is to say, something on your mind? Something bugging you today? Because the projection, as we call it, about the other driver being no good or being inept is just a way of trying to defend against these bad emotions. So I think they're twofold. Obviously, you have to correct the inappropriate or dangerous behavior. But just correcting the behavior isn't really enough. You have to get to the underlying, what we call self-state, mood, the emotional state of the individual. So even something like a positive comment on, or a humorous comment, can help bring attention to a dangerous situation. But the nice part about the humor will be that it will draw attention to how the person's feeling, not just how the person is behaving.
Good stuff. Well, I really want to ask you about how procrastination plays into all this, but I'm not quite ready to ask you. I want to wait a bit. We need to take a break.
Yeah, right.
We're going to take a break. When we come back, we're going to ask Dr. Hoffman about how procrastination plays into stupid behavior, and is it a stupid behavior itself? You're watching We Mean Business. We'll be back in seconds.
I understand you need a little help with your mortgage. Want to avoid foreclosure. Candy? Well, you know, you're in luck. We're experts in this sort of thing. Mortgage, rigmarole, whatnot. Why don't we get a contract? Who wants a contract?
Here you go, Pete.
Thanks, Betty.
Write a toner.
If you're facing foreclosure, talk to the right people. Speak with HUD-approved housing counselors free of charge at 888-995-HOPE.
Welcome back to We Mean Business. I'm Steve Dorfman, and today we're here with Dr. Thomas Hoffman asking the question, why do people do stupid things at work? So before the break, I alluded to this, that, is it fair to say that procrastination is stupid? Is that a stupid behavior? How does procrastination fit into this conversation today?
Well, it's an excellent example of one of the key mechanisms of stupid behaviors, and that is the time frame. What the time frame is for making a choice affects our choice. Procrastination is an example of short-term versus long-term thinking. This applies in a lot of situations ranging from addiction to our current debt crisis. Procrastination is very deleterious.
Wait, you have to. I don't know that
Okay,
word.
I'm sorry.
I don't know.
Procrastination is harmful.
Okay.
And deadlines can be quite important. College students, and my daughter is one, who procrastinate, wait until the last second to hand in their papers and study for their tests. People say, you know, I have to have a deadline. Well, that costs you a half-letter grade on your transcript, on each course that you take. But the initial pleasure that you get from procrastinating costs you in the long run. And that's a common mechanism of why people do stupid things. It's short-term thinking versus long-term thinking, or short-term impulsive pleasure-seeking behaviors rather than taking into account long-term views.
Yeah.
And this is very, very common. And it's also pretty natural.
Yeah. Let me do this fun thing, this interesting thing. I've got this work to do, and somebody's expecting it by a certain time, and I've got to get it to them. But, I'm just not excited about it. I'm not interested in it. Let me do this fun, interesting thing first, and then I'll get to it.
Or I don't want to do this painful thing, study for my organic chemistry test. I did that. I'm going to have lunch with my buds instead. And that is a very big problem. And it really is a highly prevalent instance of short versus long-term thinking. Short-term thinking promotes stupidity. Long-term thinking generally promotes better choices.
So how can we make that? It sounds logical, right? And it makes perfect sense to me. But I want to know how can I? What's at least the first step? How can I begin to act on that? How can I begin to make that work for me and actually do it?
Right. There are a number of techniques, if you will, that will help people make better decisions. And the first one is to reflect. From our point of view, reflection is the antidote to stupidity. If not the antidote, at least the salve on stupidity. So thinking about the problem, thinking about the issue, and not just thinking about it rationally, but looking inside at the emotions, the feelings, the affects that are associated with a certain activity is really the first step. Sometimes this is hard to do by oneself, particularly when one is in a so-called high arousal state, or working on a deadline, or having a high-risk job. And that's really where counsel comes in. So talking to a consultant doesn't have to be a paid consultant, but it can be your business partner, someone whose opinion you trust, or even putting yourself in the situation of, if I were working with someone who were doing this, let's say procrastinating, what would I advise them? How would I help them think it through? So I think that's really the first step, is reflection.
So asking yourself some really thoughtful questions, is that a good way to reflect, to have some
Right.
questions prepared for yourself?
And one good question to start with is, if my friend were doing this, what would I counsel them? What would I advise them to do?
All right. For the first time ever, we've got 4 generations in the workplace. What findings, what observations can you share with us about generational differences when it comes to doing stupid things at work?
Okay. Well, I don't think that any generation is immune to stupidity. And I don't think any generation has the corner on ways to avoid stupid decisions. The fact remains, though, that age and experience are better in terms of avoiding stupidity. There are many examples of this. If you give adolescents a choice and look at their brains, guess which areas are lighting up? The limbic regions, the emotional regions in the deeper part of the brain, more so than in the executive parts of the brain. This changes with time and experience. So it might behoove the younger people to keep this in mind. At the same time, older individuals might be in a different kind of mood that may impair their decision making. And this might be concerns about retirement, concerns about where they are, have they accomplished everything they want in their careers. So again, my prescription would be dialogue between the generations rather than having each generation in its own silo. So I think that this is an example of addressing mood, sharing mood with your colleagues can be very helpful in avoiding high risk, low reward decisions.
Sometimes an employee can have a brilliant idea or a brilliant plan, but they grapple with expressing it in an intelligent way. So nothing ever happens with it, and obviously they experience frustration because they just knew that this was something great. Maybe a year later, the company ends up doing something very similar, and that was my idea. What's at play there that they can't express their idea intelligently?
Well, again, I think it's mood. And if someone is worried about the risk or worried about shame or the possibility that people won't like the idea, it's understandable that people may not act. The way to approach this is chat about it in a more informal way with your colleagues. Although you might worry that they're going to steal it, it might be worth the risk to talk it through. This might introduce the idea of another method of decreasing risky or stupid behaviors is to actually track what's going on, to make sure that you can track the outcome of what you do and not lose sight of it. I can only imagine if General Petraeus had counted the number of emails that he was sending to Paula, he might not have continued doing it. And I just wanted to share something that struck me very much about stupid behaviors to show how important tracking might be, is that alcoholics really can't track the number of drinks that they have. So someone suggested, well, why don't the bartenders not remove the glasses?
The empties.
The empties. Yeah. So the drinks would pile up and people would see that they're drinking to excess. Well, there's a countervailing motive there for profit amongst the restaurateurs. But the fact remains, in the absence of tracking, you lose where you are in the process. So I would say that the second important function is actually to track, which is think about, see what's going on when you're making these decisions.
That's really good. What about working in groups or teams? Do we become, how does our behavior change when we work with groups or teams rather than individually?
Well, it can go many different ways, but the fact remains is that working in groups and teams, provided that the group and team is working well, is better. There's something called group IQ, which I think you've heard me talk about, that groups actually do make better decisions than individuals. There's a lot of evidence for that, but only if the group is working well. There is the possibility to become a mob when there are a lot of negative affects in the group, but in general, group decisions are better. And referring back to your question about generations, you know, the younger kids make decisions in groups. And remains to be seen how this will play out as these young people move up in responsibilities in their organizations. But the fact remains is they make pretty good decisions on what to do in their social circumstances and in their workplace by triggering one another and by checking everybody's opinion out and sorting it into the group. It does bring up one key component that applies to both groups and organizations and individuals, which is that commitment to standards, that's why the group has to have a good standard, avoids poor decisions. When the group has no standards, you're not going to have the same kind of positive outcomes as when the group does have standards. And losing track of the standards can be highly problematic.
So what would be an example of a standard or two that would be effective?
Well, I can give you a wonderful standard. Comes from the work of Dan Ariely, who is a behavioral economist. He put people into a situation that kind of encouraged them to cheat. And he was looking to see how much cheating would be going on. And these were MIT students. And he took one group and just put them in the situation, and he measured the amount of cheating. He took another group, and prior to the test, asked them, can you list the 10 commandments? He didn't say, you know, think about the 10 commandments. Just list the 10 commandments. Guess what? That group cheated less. Just having in mind the standard of the 10 commandments, not a religious standard, not a fire and brimstone standard, not a punishing standard, improved performance. So in general, standards of behavior, codes of conduct, for us physicians, the Hippocratic Oath, if we keep in mind that oath, we're not going to make the types of risky decisions that we might do under the influence of stress or financial gain, as much as when we keep in mind what we're there for.
What a great exercise. In the 30 seconds that remain, I wanted to ask you, 7 years ago when I started my company, one of my very first clients came to me and said, my people just can't think for themselves. And so my immediate reaction was, well, is it all of them? Or does it have something to do with the leadership? What's at play there? What are the dynamics at play there?
I would guess yes, and we haven't had time to talk about executive behaviors and even so-called abrasive executives who are always criticizing their own work groups. But these people are not happy with themselves. And if you're not happy with yourself, or if you're anxious in your work, you're not clear about your role, one way of avoiding thinking about that is to blame it on the other people. I work with a lot of these executives, and the first thing I work with is, how do you think these people feel when you say that? Or what's going on in your role when you make these comments about the people who are working together with you and who are serving you?
That's excellent.
So it's kind of addressing the mood, addressing the self. That's really the starting point, and everything else flows from that.
Excellent. Thanks for being with me today.
My pleasure.
You've been watching We Mean Business. To learn more about Dr. Thomas Hoffman and the consulting work that he does, you can visit wemeanbiz.tv. Thanks for tuning in. We'll catch you next time.
The average text takes your eyes off the road for nearly 5 seconds. Stop the texts, stop the wrecks.